Hi, welcome to a new video, and this is kind of a part two and a follow-on from a video I did a short while ago, which has proven to be one of the most popular videos I've put up. So thank you to everybody that's commented on that, watched it, liked it, etc. And that video was, and I'll link to it just up here, that was the why I use Micro Four Thirds to shoot gigs. And I went through the reasons why I personally choose to use Micro Four Thirds gear to shoot gigs, musical events, etc, etc. And there were a lot of comments on there, in particular from people who are also doing the same thing, which was great because I thought I was a bit of a oddball in regard to that. So thank you for everybody that commented and said they also use Micro Four Thirds to shoot gigs. I think we are a small community and often think that we're all on our own doing this, so it's good that there are more people out there. But there were also a lot of people that commented, and again thank you for doing so, asking about some of the more technical approach that I take when I'm shooting gigs with Micro Four Thirds gear, and I also mentioned that I look to do an editing video on how I then edit the final result. So this has kind of turned into a 3-video series. So I've already done the why, this one's going to be the how, and then I'll finish that up with a editing video, and I'm going to do it in that order because that order kind of makes sense, being perfectly honest with you. Okay, so this video is going to break down into 2 parts, roughly, and they're going to have their own little subject areas within them. But the 2 halves I want to look at are the approach I take. So this is less the technical settings on your camera and more the thought process and what I do when I go to shoot a gig. Now, a lot of what I'm going to go through will not necessarily be 100% pertinent to Micro Four Thirds. Some of it is, some of it's definitely pertinent to mirrorless cameras, and we'll go through that as I come about it. But certainly this first section on the approach I take, that applies to whatever the kit you're using. It really does. So that'll be the first part I'll go through, and then secondly I'll get into the more technical side of things where I'll look at autofocus modes, white balance, etc, and talk through some of that. And as I say, some of that is applicable to any camera that you're using. Now, kicking off with the approach side of things, and what I just want to say before I get into this is all of the images that you're going to see throughout this video are taken from a recent gig that I photographed. And I've chosen these particularly because it suits the topic of this video well, because it was without a doubt one of the most challenging shoots I've done in terms of gig photography for a number of reasons, and I just want to spend a moment going through those before I get into the approach and the technical side of things. So what we basically had, or what I had, was I managed to obtain a press pass, which is extremely handy because that helps massively, to a 50th anniversary tribute gig to Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. So this was a number of musicians had come together to do this with a laser show, and I was fortunate that one of the singers in this group of musicians is our friend Emma, who I photographed a lot, and she asked me to come along and photograph this and sorted out the press pass for me. So thank you so much to Emma for arranging that. That was brilliant. But it was a large venue. It was inside a church because as part of touring with this concert, they're doing it in churches and cathedrals and using the organ within there as part of the set of instruments they're using. So it kind of limits your scale. Now, I had been in this church once before for a family wedding a long time ago. I'd never seen it at night. I'd never shot I'd never even seen a band play in there, let alone shot a band in there. So that was going to be a bit unusual. So it was definitely an unknown venue to me. Lasers I'd not shot in the degree that they were used for this before, so it was unknown how that was going to affect the lighting. Obviously, being a church, is very high ceilinged as well, which means your main lights are a long way up, so that was another unknown. It was also going to be a seated event, and that presents some quite unique challenges I'll talk about as well. Also, it's a Pink Floyd gig, so these are predominantly going to be prog rock fans, which means they are very serious about their music, and that'll come on to one of the considerations you need in a moment. But yeah, it was a challenging gig, but it was absolutely amazing event. I really did love every single minute of it, and it was a privilege to be able to photograph it and to get as close as I was able to do that. Okay, so on to the approach side of things. Now, in the approach, and as I say, I want to break this down into a number of parts, and the first one is really one of the single most important things. And that is, for me, it's the fundamental of if you are shooting a live event. Certainly this applies to music, but I think it would apply to any live event, and that is, you, the photographer, are not important. You're not, okay? Nobody has gone there to watch you. Nobody has gone there to see you take photographs. They have gone there to watch the music, to watch the artist, to see them perform, to listen to them. What they do not want is a photographer standing in front of them, getting in their way, constantly moving about, being a distraction. And you will get people complain about you if that's what you end up being. So you need to be really careful in that regard. So I'll come on and talk about this in a moment, but it means that you've got to make sure that you minimise the impact you have on yourself and on the artists playing, the musicians playing, the band playing. Doesn't matter who or what they are, doesn't matter whether it's a single person standing up there with a guitar or whatever performing, or a full set of musicians as this one was, you know, with lighting control, etc, etc. You need to try and be as invisible as possible. And I've spent a lot of time over the years trying to do this as well as I can. So you've got to be aware of where you can stand, where you can't stand. Try not to stand in people's line of sight. And this was particularly challenging at this gig because it was a seated event. So the second you stand up, you're immediately taller than absolutely everybody in there. So what I ended up using was, certainly I used the pillars that were in the church, because if I stand in front of a pillar, well, that pillar's already blocking people's view, so I'm not going to be in anybody's way if I'm doing that. I also try and keep down as low as possible. I will sit on the floor at gigs quite happily. I do it at probably just about every gig I photograph. I will actually sit on the ground, and I will scoot around on the ground. I may look a bit of an idiot doing it, but if somebody is looking over me at a band, I am not in their way. And I move slowly. Don't move quickly, don't run around, try and stay low, move slowly, and plan where you're going to be so that you're not constantly moving from one side of the stage or performance area to another, that you're not constantly moving up and down across aisles. Plan and think about what you're going to do and how you're going to move around. So pick a location, stay there for a while. Take a good set from there, then move. You can always come back later on if you've got enough time, but make the most out of a location when you're shooting it. And it's important. So that's the first and single most important thing about shooting, or rather the approach you take to shooting music events. You, the photographer, are not important. Okay, you have to be as invisible as possible. Okay, the second piece I want to talk about in approaching shooting live music is it really does help if you have a good understanding of music and how music is played live. Now, it's not an essential one, but it really does help. I've known musicians and people playing in bands, etc., for decades, since I was a teenager. These are the kind of people that I've been friends with, and I've spent a lot of time with. I've also dabbled with music myself. Unfortunately, due to a hand condition, I can no longer play guitar, but I did very badly play guitar, and it's given me an understanding of how people approach that instrument and talk to musicians. Not just at venues, go out and talk to musicians about how they approach it. Listen to interviews with musicians and how they approach what they're doing. Learn what is important to them about their instrument and everything that surrounds their instrument, because it will give you a much better understanding of where and what you should focus on when you are photographing either somebody playing that instrument or that instrument itself. You'll also have an idea of how it's going to be used in certain circumstances and the dynamics behind it. And that gives you a much better insight into catching shots that matter, and will mean something to the person playing that instrument when you show them your shots. It seems a bit strange, but it is absolutely true that if you understand how somebody approaches playing and performing with a particular instrument, it will make a big difference to how you photograph them. And the more you know about it, the more you'll have an understanding of how to approach it. And it really does pay dividends. So speak to musicians, spend as much time with musicians as you can, watch musicians performing, try and learn and understand the process they go through with that particular instrument. It will pay dividends, I absolutely promise. Right, on to the third approach with regard to, or rather the third part of how I approach photographing gigs. So, this is really key and really important. Speak to the people you're going to be photographing. Okay, I've seen so many photographers at venues turn up, not talk to anybody, take a load of photographs, and go. And I wonder what the mindset behind that is. One of the things you want to do is minimise how much you disrupt the band. And the first and foremost step to that is letting them know who the hell you are and what you're going to be doing. It's the same with the venue itself. So I try, if I can, if I know I'm going to be photographing a band, I try and speak to the venue ahead of time. If not, I will make sure to turn up early and introduce myself to the people who work at the venue. And there's certain people you can't necessarily do that with, the people on the sound desk, etc., people running lighting rigs and so on. But try and turn up early, try and get in early if you can, try and speak to those people. There is a time from when doors open, even if you can't get in early, there's a time from when doors open and a band starts playing. And it's normally a good half hour. You have time to speak to people. Now, in certain circumstances, some people are easier than others. The door staff at a venue, the bar staff at a venue, the people on the sound desk, they're all easily accessible and you can speak to them ahead of the performance starting. The band might not be so easy. Now, if you're fortunate, I know and am friends with a lot of the bands I photograph, so I know how they operate and they know me, which is great. But there was a time when that wasn't the case for almost every single one of these people, so I had to build that rapport. If you can't get to speak to the band before you start shooting, if there is an interval, go and speak to them then. Make contact with them, have a chat, just explain what you're doing, explain why you're doing it, explain how they can see your photographs. They are not psychic, they're not going to know who you are. So make sure you take that step. Introduce yourself. And that leads on to the fourth and final piece of the approach, which is don't just introduce yourself, but also spend some of that time getting to know the venue. Have a look around it. Now, in some cases, it's going to be a really small venue and it's, okay, there's the stage, there's either side of it, bingo, done. In the case of larger venues, you might want to have a bit more of a look around. Look at where you can photograph unusual shots from. A lot of people will not photograph anything other than straight on or pretty much straight on. I like to try and look at other places that I can shoot from behind the band or the musicians, from the side, from down low. Hold your camera up high and get shots. You know, think about how you're going to get shots, and also think about what is going to be behind the people that you're photographing, because a lot of the time you can get some really interesting shots juxtapositioning what's in the background with the actual person that you're shooting, or the musician or the instrument that you're shooting. Other times you need to be aware of what's in the background because it might be a distraction to what you're shooting and you want to remove it. So you want to make sure that, right, I'm definitely not taking a shot down that sight line because that big poster, whatever it is in the background, is going to be immensely distracting. And leading on from that, as well as mixing up where you shoot from by knowing the venue, also mix up your shots. Don't just go in there and shoot a bunch of musicians playing. Obviously that's your main focus, photograph them, but think about photographing instruments, close-ups of instruments while they're being played. The instruments when they are actually down on the ground or on stands, you can get some really great, really fascinating shots of that kind of thing just by looking at it. Photograph the venue staff, and photograph the audience. Basically just photograph every damn thing you can. Look for interesting shots everywhere. You will tend to think, and certainly when you first start shooting, your focus will be on the band and the musicians, and that's only natural. But try and think beyond that. Photograph what's going on around you, the people enjoying it, the atmosphere. And that's the key thing. Try and capture the atmosphere of the event, not just the event. And that's what will make the difference, in my opinion anyways. What I feel makes the difference is trying to capture the atmosphere of what's going on within that event. So those are four things to consider that I consider and take into account when I approach photographing a gig, no matter where it is. So if you consider those when you start, or if you're already doing it, if you're not thinking about these things, try and keep them at the forefront of your mind when you're photographing. It will make a big difference. And obviously the more you do this, the more you photograph in particular venues, the easier this will get, because some of these things will become automatic. You will know the bands, you will know the staff and the people at the venue. You'll even get to know some of the audience fairly well, because the same people will be coming back to watch music at certain venues on a regular basis. But those are the approaches that I take when I photograph events. Okay, on to the technical side of things. And as I say, a lot of people wrote on the comments about what were my technical approaches to photographing events. So how did I go around it from a technical point of view? So let's start off with those. And the first one I want to talk about is, what autofocus settings do I use? Now, I've shot gigs, manual focus, 35mm film cameras, and interestingly, although I haven't got the results back from them yet, I did photograph this particular gig, not just with my 2 Micro Four Thirds films, but I also took along a Canon A1 with some Ilford Delta 3200, pushed to 6400 ASA in there, so it'd be interesting to see what they come back like. And it was interesting going back to manual focus, and being perfectly honest, it made me appreciate exactly what we've got now, even if some of my kit is still not the most modern out there. So as regulars to the channel will know, when I'm shooting gigs, I use a combination of my Olympus EM1 Mark II and my Lumix GX7, and I pair those with a 20mm f1.7 lens, which works out, once you take the crop factor into account, to be a 40mm f1.7, and a 45mm f1.7, which converted works out to be a 90mm f1.7. So effectively I've got a pretty much standard lens on the 40mm and a short telephoto with the 90mm. Now for this event I did also take along my Seven Artisans 7.5mm 2.8, which is a 50mm super wide angle but full frame, not full frame sensor size, but it's not a circular image, it's a full framed image fisheye lens, because I knew the lenses, I knew the lasers were going to be there, so that added to some of the fun. But I also knew at 2.8 that was going to be a slow lens to use as well. So with the autofocus side of things, that's what I was talking about before I went off on a tangent about lenses there, my apologies. What I basically use on these is, on the Olympus, I use the AF tracking mode, and I have that set to a 5x5 grid in the centre of the screen because I find it works best there, and I have that set to face detect. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest, it doesn't pick up faces all of the time, particularly if there's a lot of flashing lights going on there. It works better in pubs and cafes than it does in proper established venues with a lot of stage lighting, but it still does a reasonably good enough job, and it's fairly accurate, it's fairly quick, and it focuses pretty well. It also allows me to minimise the amount of focus and recompose that I have to do, and the tracking does work pretty well on it with people moving backwards and forwards, and it's for that reason I tend to stick the 45mm on the Olympus, because with the short telephoto side of things, the tracking works better in regard to that. So that's what I use on that. I very rarely will override it with manual focus unless I absolutely need to, and most of the time I don't need to. It's just looking for and anticipating shots and setting them up, and that's one of the main things, is look for patterns of movement in people and pick up on that. Now with the just bend down and pick it up. With the GX7, although it does have autofocus tracking, I've got to be perfectly honest, certainly in clubs and bars and venues and places like that, it's rubbish. So I actually stick this on single point autofocus, which you can set up on the GX7 to magnify the screen, and it is quite literally just a little cross in the centre of the screen, which means I do have to focus and recompose, so half press, focus, half press, recompose, shoot with that. But I find that works quite well, particularly when paired with the 20mm on there, and I use that for the kind of more standard-ish type shots on there, and that works well enough in all honesty. But it allows me, with the magnifier, because it's the standard view, it means I can be a lot more sure about where I'm focusing and getting that spot, particularly for trying to get a focus on somebody's face or ideally their eye, and that makes the most out of what is now quite an old, I think it's around about 10 years old, the GX7, so quite an old in terms of technology focusing system that exists on here. When it comes to the manual focus lens, so the 7.5mm TT Artisan super wide fisheye type thing that I used for a couple of shots on this gig, basically, I use that in focus peeping mode so that you get the nice highlights on the contrast areas, or sorry, the highlight on the highlight areas, so you can see what's in focus. And fortunately, even at 2.8, you're not going to have much problem with a fisheye lens getting everything in frame and in focus. It's still at that wide an aperture got a stupidly deep depth of field on it. So that's the approach I take with autofocus. Right, on to white balance, and this one will be really quick because with white balance I tend to never change it from auto white balance. I just don't. I find that the auto white balance in the Olympus works well enough in most cases. The auto white balance in the GX7, again, older technology, is not quite as good. So I find I tend to have to correct this, the GX7, more in post than I do the Olympus. But I tend to deal with my white balance in post rather than in camera. And there is a reason for that. And I know this might not work for everybody, but certainly it works for me. With a lot of coloured lighting going on in gigs and events, white balance is a subjective matter when it comes to the final result anyway. You know, I've taken shots that have a really harsh blue light on them and managed to pretty much remove it in post if I want. The problem is, why the hell would I want to do that? Because that strong blue light is a part of what the audience is seeing. So it's a different situation than most cases, white balanced in gig shooting and event, musical event shooting, in that very often you're not trying to get the white balance back to what will be considered proper white balance. You actually want the colour cast remaining in there because that's part of what you're shooting. So it's an interesting challenge in that regard. And that's also an important point, by the way, if you ever get any of your work printed, because I have on a few occasions had labs, even professional labs, try colour correcting work off the back of that. And it's kind of like, no, it's supposed to be blue, it's supposed to be green, red, whatever. That's how I shot it and how I want it. Please stop faffing around with it and trying to make the skin tones look natural. They shouldn't in this case. So, white balance, quite a quick one, as I say. I leave it on auto. I then edit in post to basically get the effect I want. Either keep it or remove it, dial it up or dial it down. And I just find you've got more control doing it that way. And that's what works for me in that regard. Right, next up we have metering. Now, I want to talk about the evolution of how metering has changed for me over the years. So if we go back far enough, when I first started shooting gigs way back in the day when I had my Canon A1 the first time round, and I didn't have any option. That was just center weighted metering, so that's what you used and you hoped a lot, being perfectly honest. As time went on and I picked up my Canon T90, this gave me a bit more control in what I did, and very often I used to shoot with a combo of a Canon T90 and a Canon F1, and very often I'd use the T90 for metering and then set the correct settings as I found them manually on the F1 off the back of that, because what I used to use there is the kind of matrix metering mode on the T90 if I was shooting in an area with fairly, how can I put it, even-ish lighting. So a pub or a club without heavy stage lighting, I'd use matrix metering in that regard because it worked out pretty well, being perfectly honest with you. When it came to shooting an event with a lot of stage lights, particularly harsh directional stage lights, coloured lights, be it gels or modern LED lights, then I'd switch over to spot metering to be able to meter off of the area that's illuminated, and that obviously paid dividends. And that's why I used the T90, because that had really good spot metering in it. In fact, it had multi-point spot metering in it, which you couldn't really use quick enough in a gig, but there's an excellent metering system in it. And then I'd transfer that over, as I say, manually to the F1. These days, I tend to stick to the matrix metering mode in the cameras, or whatever it's called. I did make a note of this. Multi-metering in the Lumix and ESP metering on the Olympus. And the reason why is because they're both mirrorless, and that gives some big advantages that I want to talk about next. Okay, so those advantages that you get from mirrorless cameras. Now, obviously, my mirrorless cameras of choice are my Micro Four Thirds ones, but other mirrorless cameras are available. And this is the reason why I tend to stick with the kind of matrix type metering in there, and that's because you're getting a real-time preview of how the lighting is going to look in the EVF, or on the back LCD screen if you want to use it, but the viewfinder is what I use most of the time. So I tend to then stick with the matrix metering and use exposure compensation, and I use exposure compensation quite heavily in real time to judge what kind of effect I want. I find it really useful for getting the correct metering, or as near as damn it, and yes, I am having to eyeball it, but I find the results work really well by using exposure compensation in real time, seeing what I'm getting in the viewfinder to actually get the exposure right. And for that, I found that the matrix style metering that pretty much all modern cameras have one form of it or another, but the matrix style metering works much better as a base point for that. So yeah, I use that quite heavily. So I always have, if a camera doesn't have a dedicated exposure compensation dial on it, rather than a button and having to press that and dial in the exposure compensation, and I'll talk more about modes that I shoot in a moment, what I tend to then do is just have one of the dials on the camera set to exposure compensation, so I can just quite literally just hit the dial, turn it, and I'm seeing what effect I want. And you get to see, in most cases, in the viewfinder exactly what you've got that exposure compensation set to as well. So, as I say, I use, because of the advantages of mirrorless and electronic viewfinders, I use exposure compensation an awful lot to get the metering right, but I am eyeballing it to a large degree, and it's a benefit of modern systems. Okay, so in terms of the mode I use, and might come as a surprise to some people, I don't know, but I use aperture priority pretty much exclusively because, caveat that, I use aperture priority when I am shooting gigs pretty much exclusively. If I'm not shooting a gig, I will vary what I'm using depending on what results I want to get. But when I'm shooting gigs and events, musical events and things like that, I use aperture priority. The simple reason being, I need to get as much light into the camera as I possibly can, so I use aperture priority, and in almost every single case, the lens is wide open. Absolutely wide open. Am I going to get edge-to-edge sharpness off the back of that? Nope, of course I'm not. But I'm aware of that, and I frame accordingly. And let's be honest, I'm not shooting a landscape or an architectural shot here where somebody is going to be looking at the brickwork in the bottom left-hand corner and critiquing how sharp it is. Although even if I was, I think people who do that will be a bit weird anyway, but that's an aside. Centre sharpness is what I'm after here. That is where the subject is going to be, in or around that area predominantly. So I shoot wide open, I need as high a shutter speed as I can get, so basically I shoot pretty much everything absolutely wide open to give me that amount of light. Now, I do occasionally shoot gigs in daylight, festivals, things like that, local summer events. There, things will vary, but I'm focusing mainly on the trickier stuff here, which is the gigs that I'm talking about. So those get shot wide open because that's the only way to get as much light in there and up that shutter speed as you can. So nice easy one. My mode, aperture priority, done and dusted. Right, on to the final bit, which is my ISO settings, and I tend to stick to auto ISO. My main interest is composition and getting the shot and capturing that moment when I'm photographing. I don't want too many variables to worry about. I can keep an eye on them and correct them if I need to, but I want the technology to do a fair amount of the work for me, being perfectly honest. I will obviously, of course, keep an eye on the shutter speed that I'm getting, but I tend to run in auto ISO, and what that basically means is for my EM1, that gives me between 200 ASA and 6400 ASA. That's not where the ISO caps out on that particular camera, that's where the auto ISO caps out. So if I do want to go above that, I've got to manually override it on the Olympus, and I have done on a few occasions. But what I tend to do is leave that to the GX7, because auto on the GX7 will run from, actually I don't know what the base limit on this is, I think it might be 200 again, but I will run this from 200 up to a maximum ISO of 12,800. Now, I'll be perfectly honest with you, a shot out of this in 12,800 ASA is going to need to be absolutely bang on with the exposure, and you're going to have to do a fair bit of work in post to get decent results out of it. But they're not all throwaways, okay? There have been a couple, at least one, in the set of photographs I've been showing as I've been talking around this. So, it's not all a throwaway in that regard. Now, I tend to, as I say, find that most of the ISOs I'm dealing with, and certainly I checked for this particular event, tend to be around the 1600 ISO up to around about 5,000. You'll get a few that will cap out higher than that. You'll very rarely get a few lower than that. But I did notice, I think I took one shot at this event that it was 200 ASA. So you are dealing with quite a wide range of ISOs that are coming into play. And this, to a large degree, is why I leave it on auto. If you are having to constantly faff around with this, with the lights changing all over the place, you would be missing shots left, right and centre. Let the technology put the base settings in there for you. Use exposure compensation to correct as you feel you need to off of the back of that, but be aware of what it's doing, and if you need to, override it. But for me, it's not worth playing around with constantly off of the back of that. Now, obviously, what I've been talking about here is, in detail, two sides of the exposure triangle. So what I do in terms of ISO, what I do in terms of aperture, nice and easy, wide open. So where does this give us shutter speeds off of the back of that? Well, generally, I found, and I had a look at the shots from this gig, that most of them were in the region of around about an 80th to 100th of a second off of the, and somewhere in that ballpark. I think the slowest that I dealt with on this was around about a 15th of a second. I got a decent shot out of that. Now, part of the reason why I got a decent shot out of that is, being perfectly honest, because again, modern technology and the image stabilization that's built into these cameras, particularly the Olympus, is excellent. So I'm not having to worry too much about my own steadiness, which in my 50s is not as good as it used to be. Because the cameras will help out with that. So then really your only critical factor is, what is the subject doing? Now in some cases, getting some movement in there actually helps. So you need to be aware of that and not always shy away from, ooh, I don't want to do that. And I have, not in this particular gig, but I have in gigs in the past actually slowed right the way down so that, I'm getting deliberate movement in there, and I've done that quite a few times and taken shots down as low as 1/4 of a second. The image stabilization helps keep the background reasonably sharp, but your subject's got a lot of movement going on in there, and you can get some interesting results off of the back of that. So yeah, that's where we end up with shutter speeds in regard to the exposure triangle and my wide open apertures and auto ISO. That basically is the approach I take to how I shoot gigs using Micro Four Thirds. Now, as I've mentioned, a lot of this can apply to other cameras. Just about the only one that, might not, you'd need a mirrorless, of which Micro Four Thirds are all mirrorless, is the ability to actually eyeball what's going on with the exposure compensation through the EVF. It does give you that advantage. But hopefully you found this video useful. As I say, it is a continuation of the first video I did, which is why I choose to use Micro Four Thirds. This has been how I shoot gigs using Micro Four Thirds, and in the final one, which will be coming up in hopefully a week or two's time, I'm going to talk about how I then edit those shots to give you the kind of end results that you've been seeing throughout this video. So if you do like them, keep an eye out for that particular video. And if you've enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and if you want to see more content like this, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified when new content gets uploaded. Thanks very much for watching, everyone. Take care. Bye.